At my son's retirement party, he stood up in front of 60 people, raised his glass, and said the only regret he had was spending so many years pretending I was the father he deserved. His wife smiled, his in-laws nodded, and I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket, pulled out a sealed envelope, and set it on the table in front of him. What he found inside ended the party before dessert was served. I want to tell you how we got there. My name is Raymond Collier. I'm 63 years old. I spent 22 years in the United States Army, retired as a master sergeant out of Fort Bragg, and spent another decade after that working as a facilities supervisor for a county hospital in Greenville, South Carolina. I am not a complicated man. I believe in work, in keeping your word, and in the idea that a man's home is the one place on earth where he has the right to feel safe. I bought my house on Weston Creek Road in 2004. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a back porch that faces a stand of longleaf pines, and a garage big enough to hold my truck and my woodworking equipment. I paid it off in 2019. My wife, Patrice, helped me plant the garden along the south fence before she passed from congestive heart failure in 2021. The rose bushes she put in are still there. I water them every Thursday morning. After Patrice died, the house felt different. Not haunted, exactly, but quieter in a way that had weight to it. My son, Marcus, called every few weeks, and for a while, those calls were genuine. Checking in, asking how I was sleeping, telling me about his work. He managed distribution logistics for a manufacturing company out of Charlotte. He'd done well for himself. I was proud of him, the kind of proud that sits low in your chest and doesn't need to be said out loud. His wife, Brenda, was cordial. Never warm, but cordial. She came from money, the kind of money that doesn't announce itself but makes itself known in small ways. The way she looked around rooms she entered for the first time, evaluating. The way she said, of course, when she meant if I must. I noticed these things but didn't dwell on them. She made my son happy, and that was what mattered. The arrangement that eventually destroyed things started in the fall of 2022. Marcus called on a Tuesday evening. I was on the back porch, drinking coffee and watching the pines go dark as the sun dropped. He said that his company was transferring him to a regional office outside of Greenville, which was good news, a promotion. But the transition period was complicated. Housing was expensive, the timing was difficult, and he and Brenda were thinking about whether it made sense to stay with me temporarily while they figured things out. Just a few months, he said, just until they found the right place. I told him yes without hesitation. He was my son. The house had 3 bedrooms. The math was simple, and so was the answer. They moved in on a Saturday in October. Marcus and a friend from work carried boxes. Brenda directed traffic from the driveway, pointing at rooms, issuing instructions in a tone that was efficient and pleasant, and somehow also a declaration of territory. By Sunday evening, their things occupied the master bedroom, the guest room, and half the garage. I had moved my tools to one corner to make space. Nobody asked about the tools. Nobody mentioned the garage. I told myself it was an adjustment period. By December, Brenda's mother had arrived for the holidays. That visit stretched from 2 weeks to 6, and then into January. Her name was Dolores, and she was a small woman with opinions about everything. The temperature of the house, the brand of coffee, the fact that my woodworking equipment made noise on Saturday mornings. She occupied the 3rd bedroom the way an army occupies a city, with certainty and without asking permission. I moved a cot into my workshop. I want to be clear about what I mean when I say that. My workshop is a converted storage room off the garage, about 12 feet by 14. I had insulated it myself and put down rubber flooring so I could work on weekends without bothering neighbors. It had a single window that faced the driveway and a space heater that I'd owned since Fort Bragg. I slept on a cot in my workshop, in the house I owned, because my son's mother-in-law was using my bedroom. I told myself it was temporary. By February, I had stopped telling myself things. The night I understood what was actually happening, I had come in through the garage door after a late walk. I do that sometimes in winter, when I can't sleep and the cold air helps. The kitchen light was on. I could hear voices through the door, Brenda and her mother and Marcus, and the sound of them talking is what made me stop before entering. Not any particular word, just the quality of it. Deliberate, focused. The way people talk when they're solving a problem. I stood in the doorway between the garage and the kitchen, and I listened. Brenda was speaking. She was talking about the property records, about how South Carolina handled title transfers between family members, about something she'd read regarding gift deeds and estate planning. Her voice was measured and practical, the voice of someone who had done research. Her mother said the timing needed to be right, that if it was framed as estate planning, as something Raymond was choosing to do for his son's financial security, it would be easier. People don't question a father wanting to protect his children. Marcus said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "He'll do it if I ask him the right way. He always does." I stood in the garage in the dark for a long time after that. I am a deliberate man. 22 years in the army will do that to you. You learn not to move until you understand the terrain. You learn that the difference between a good outcome and a catastrophic one is often just the quality of your patience. I went back to my cot, and I lay there with my eyes open, and I did what I had done in the military when the situation required it. I assessed. I planned. I identified what I knew, what I didn't know, and what I needed to find out. What I knew, my son and his wife were living in my home without paying rent, without a written agreement, without any arrangement I had consented to in writing. Dolores had been occupying my bedroom for nearly 3 months. My name was on the deed. I had no mortgage. The house was mine in every legal sense. What I didn't know, how far they had taken this, whether they had already spoken to an attorney, whether there were documents already drafted that they were waiting to put in front of me. What I needed to find out, all of it. I had a friend named Clyde Patterson who had spent 30 years as a real estate attorney in Greenville before retiring to consult work. We had known each other since our kids were in Little League together. I called him at 7 the next morning, told him I needed to meet, and that it was not a casual conversation. He told me to come by his house at 9. Clyde listened without interrupting. He had a yellow legal pad and he made notes while I talked, his handwriting small and precise. When I finished, he asked 3 questions. Had I signed anything? Had I given them any written authorization over my finances? And had I ever made any recorded statements about transferring the property? No, no, and no. He set down his pen. "Raymond," he said, "you are in a strong position legally, but you need to move carefully and document everything. They can't transfer property without your signature, but they can create circumstances that put pressure on you to sign. They can manufacture dependency, establish patterns of financial intermingling, make it look like a collaborative arrangement rather than what it actually is." His voice was steady, the voice of someone explaining a weather system. Not alarmed, just accurate. The fact that they're living rent-free in your house already establishes a dynamic that a skilled attorney could try to leverage. You need to be ahead of this. He referred me to a real estate attorney, a woman named Catherine Webb, who specialized in property disputes and elder financial exploitation. He also referred me to a forensic accountant named David Roth, in case my finances had already been compromised in ways I hadn't noticed. I drove to Catherine Webb's office that same afternoon. She was methodical and blunt, which I appreciated. She pulled up my property records, reviewed the deed, and confirmed what Clyde had said. The house was mine, clean title, no encumbrances. Nobody could transfer it without my signature and notarization. But she walked me through what a fraudulent gift deed attempt could look like, what to watch for, and how to document the current situation to protect myself if it escalated. After Catherine, I sat in my car in the parking garage for 20 minutes and ran the numbers from memory. I had a savings account, a money market account, a pension from my Army service, and a 401k from my years at the hospital. I had given Marcus a credit card on my account 2 years ago, around the time of Patrice's death, when I was struggling to keep track of things, and he had offered to help manage some household expenses. I had asked him to use it for specific things: medications, utilities, emergency repairs. I called David Roth's office from that parking garage and made an appointment for the following morning. David Roth had the kind of office that felt like a library. quiet and organized and faintly serious. He pulled up the credit card statements with the efficiency of someone who had done this hundreds of times, which he had. He didn't say anything for several minutes. Then he turned the monitor toward me. The total over 26 months was $67,000. I looked at the screen. My breathing was even. I had learned a long time ago not to let your face show the hit before you've assessed the damage. David walked me through it line by line. Restaurant charges, multiple times per week at places I had never been to, clothing retailers, a home furnishing store in Charlotte that accounted for nearly $8,000 in a 6-month span, hotel stays in Asheville, in Savannah, in Hilton Head, spa services, 2 airline tickets to Cancun in March of 2023. He said, "I want to make sure I understand the scope of authorization you provided. You said this card was for household emergencies." I said yes. He said, "None of this is household emergencies." I had the card canceled before I left his office. David archived the statements and offered to prepare a formal financial analysis report if needed for legal proceedings. I told him to prepare it. Catherine Webb, when I called her that evening, told me to hold everything and not act yet. "Wait for the right moment," she said. "Don't tip them off. Let me prepare the documents." The right moment arrived 6 weeks later, and it arrived in the form of an invitation. Marcus had been promoted at the company. Regional director. It was a significant step, and the company was hosting a retirement party for the outgoing regional director, which also served as a welcome event for Marcus taking over the role. A Friday evening dinner at a venue called the Meridian in downtown Greenville. 60 guests. Dinner, speeches, open bar. Black tie suggested. I received my invitation in the mail, my name written in clean block letters on a cream envelope. I noticed that the return address was Brenda's mother's handwriting. I sat at my kitchen table that evening, the invitation in my hand, and I made the decision I had been building toward for 6 weeks. I could serve the legal documents quietly, with no witnesses, in the privacy of my own home, or I could wait 11 more days. Let them arrive at the Meridian in their best clothes. Let Marcus stand up in front of his colleagues and his in-laws and everyone who mattered to him professionally. Let him commit to whatever version of himself he planned to perform that night. And then give him something to open. I had been a soldier. I understood the concept of the decisive moment. I called Catherine Webb the next morning and told her I needed everything ready in 10 days. She said, "Are you sure about the timing?" I said, "Yes." The 11 days were quiet. I maintained my routines. I came in through the garage each evening, ate dinner in my workshop because the kitchen had become Brenda and Dolores's domain, worked on a cedar chest I was building for no particular reason, and went to sleep. Marcus knocked on the workshop door once to ask if I would be joining them for dinner on Sunday. I said I had plans. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't read and nodded and left. The morning of the party, I drove to Catherine's office. The documents were laid out on her conference table in 4 sets, one for each occupant. She walked me through each one clearly. The first was a certified copy of the property deed, with my name underlined and annotated. The second was a formal notice of intent to terminate occupancy for all non-owner residents, giving 30 days as required under South Carolina law. The third was a revocation of authorized user status on my credit account, dated and notarized, with a summary of the $67,000 in unauthorized charges itemized on an attached page. The fourth was a referral document from a law enforcement financial crimes unit that David Roth had contacted through proper channels, initiating a formal review of potential elder financial exploitation under South Carolina Code, Section 4.33510. Catherine said, "This last one is not a criminal charge. It's a notice that an investigation has been initiated. It does not mean he will be charged, but it means the matter is now on record." I said I understood. She sealed each set of documents in an envelope and handed them to me. I put them in my briefcase. We shook hands. She said, "Raymond, I want you to know that this is one of the cleaner cases I've seen. You have done everything right." I drove home, showered, put on my dress uniform, which I had not worn in years but which still fit, pressed and dark and deliberate, and drove to the Meridian. The venue was a converted textile building, exposed brick and high ceilings, and Edison lights strung in geometric patterns over tables covered in white linen. A bar occupied one corner. A jazz quartet played near the far windows. The room held the comfortable energy of a professional celebration, people loosened by open bars and the relief of a Friday evening. I found my name on the seating chart, table 9. Not near the family, not near Marcus. Table 9 was positioned behind a structural column that partially blocked the view of the main table, adjacent to the kitchen entrance. I stood at the seating chart for a moment, studying it, then walked to table 9 and sat down. The envelope rested in my briefcase, under my chair. I had transferred it to my jacket pocket before entering, and I could feel its weight against my ribs with each breath. Dinner moved in the standard rhythm of these events. Salad, an entree of chicken or salmon, remarks from company executives about the outgoing director's tenure. Marcus sat at the head table with Brenda beside him, both of them polished and composed. Brenda's mother sat at the adjacent table with two women I didn't recognize. I watched them without being obvious about it, the way I had watched rooms for 22 years. Nobody came to table 9 to check on me. The waiter brought my salmon last. At 8:45, the event coordinator handed Marcus the microphone. He looked comfortable at that podium. He had his mother's bearing, upright and calm, and he knew how to hold a room. He thanked the company. He thanked his colleagues. He thanked his wife, turning to Brenda with the practiced warmth of someone who understood the performance required of him. The room applauded. Then he paused, and something shifted in his expression. A settling, the performance becoming something else. "There's one more thing I want to say," he said, "about family, about the kind of clarity that comes when you build a life that's truly your own." The room quieted. He said that he had spent a long time in the shadow of expectations he hadn't chosen, that his upbringing had been defined by a certain rigidity, a certain coldness, that he had worked hard to move beyond. He looked across the room. I knew before his eyes found me that they were going to. "They found me at table 9, behind the column," he said. "My father is here tonight, and I want him to know that this chapter, what I'm stepping into, this is mine, not his. I built this without him, and I'll be honest, there's a freedom in that I didn't expect to feel." The room was not sure how to respond. A few people clapped uncertainly. Most were still, reading the air. He said, "Dad, I respect what you gave me, but I don't owe you the rest of my life." Someone at a nearby table whispered something to her companion. A man in the back shifted in his chair. I set down my water glass. The sound it made against the table was precise and clean. I stood. The room watched me. The column was to my left, and stepping around it put me in clear sightline of the head table and most of the 60 guests. I buttoned my jacket. I was aware of what I looked like, a 63-year-old man in a dress uniform, taking his time. The room waited. I walked toward the front of the room, not quickly, not with anger. The way I had walked into briefing rooms and command offices for 2 decades, with the particular stillness of someone who has already decided what is going to happen. Marcus watched me come. Brenda's expression shifted from satisfaction to something more careful. Her mother leaned forward in her chair. I reached the head table and stopped. I didn't take the microphone. I didn't need it. The room was quiet enough that when I spoke, the people in the back could hear me without difficulty. I said, "I'm glad you spoke, Marcus. I've been waiting for an honest conversation." I reached into my jacket pocket. The envelope was white, sealed, and I held it for a moment in both hands before setting it on the table in front of him. "Open it," I said. He looked at the envelope the way people look at things they already know are going to be bad. Then he picked it up, because 60 people were watching him, and there was no other choice. He tore it open with the practiced confidence of a man who believes he controls the room. The first page was the property deed. He stared at it. I watched his face absorb the information. My name at the top, sole owner, the address of Weston Creek Road, typed clearly, the date of purchase, the confirmation of no outstanding encumbrances. He turned to the second page. The 30-day notice was standard legal document format. Catherine's firm letterhead at the top, the language precise and formal. All non-owner occupants. Vacate by the date specified. I watched him read the words. I watched him understand them. Brenda reached over and took the papers from his hand, flipping through them quickly, her composure working hard to hold. When she reached the third page, the credit card summary, the itemized list of $67,000 in charges, her hand tightened on the paper. Marcus turned to me and said my name in a voice that was not what it had been 60 seconds ago. I said, $67,000, Marcus. Restaurant dinners, hotel stays, spa services, airline tickets. I want you to tell me which of those was a medical emergency. Which one was a utility bill? Which one was the kind of household repair I gave you that card to handle? The room was absolutely still. He said, Dad, this isn't the place. I said, you chose the place when you took the microphone. I didn't raise my voice. I want to be clear about that. Every word I said at the Meridian was at conversational volume, level, and measured. The voice of someone who has spent a long time deciding exactly what they're going to say and is now simply saying it. I gestured to the fourth document, the referral notice from the Financial Crimes Unit. I said, this is a notice that the South Carolina Attorney General's office has received a referral regarding the charges on that account. It's not a criminal charge. Not yet. That depends on how the next 30 days go. Brenda set the documents down on the white tablecloth. Her mother had stood up from her table across the room. The jazz quartet had stopped playing entirely. 60 people sat in a silence that had the specific texture of a room that has just witnessed something it didn't expect. Marcus said, you can't do this. I said, I can. I have. You have 30 days to vacate my property. All of you. South Carolina law requires that notice period, and I've followed the process exactly. I looked at him directly. I had spent 22 years in the Army learning what it meant to hold a position, what it meant to stand in a place that required standing in. I said, you told this room you built your life without me. I'm here to help you start. I picked up the documents from the table, because they were my documents, and they had done their work. I folded them once, placed them back in the envelope, and put the envelope in my jacket pocket. I straightened my jacket. I said nothing else. I turned and walked back toward the exit, past table 9, past the jazz quartet, through the double doors, and into the Greenville night. The drive to the hotel took 12 minutes. I had booked a room 3 weeks earlier, knowing I wouldn't want to go back to the house that night. It was a clean room with a view of the downtown skyline and a desk where I could set down my briefcase. I took off my jacket, hung it over the chair, sat on the edge of the bed, and was quiet for a while. My phone started ringing at 9:47. Marcus. I let it go to voicemail. It rang again. Brenda. Again. Marcus. I silenced it, set it face down on the nightstand, and tried to sleep. I mostly succeeded. In the morning, I had coffee at the desk and reviewed the documentation one more time. Not because I doubted it. Habit. The military teaches you to check your equipment before the operation, and again after, and again in the morning. Marcus called 11 times that Sunday. I listened to 3 of the voicemails before I stopped. The first was angry. He said I had embarrassed him in front of his professional colleagues, and that I had no right to do what I did, and that a real father would have come to him privately. The second was different, quieter, almost confused, as if the anger had burned through and left something less certain underneath. The third was Brenda, which I had not expected. Her voice was controlled, but the control was working hard. She said they needed to talk, that there were things I didn't understand, that the financial situation was complicated, and she could explain it if I gave her the opportunity. I didn't return any of them. On Monday morning, I called Catherine Webb and told her the documents had been delivered. She asked how it went. I said it went as expected. She said their attorney, if they retained one, had 30 days to file any challenge, but that the legal ground was firm. She had also filed a formal complaint with the county regarding the credit card usage, supplementing David Roth's referral. She said, Raymond, they may try to negotiate. They may try to make this about your mental capacity, about your grief after Patrice, about whether you were in a state to be making financial decisions. Be prepared for that. I told her I had been prepared for a long time. The challenge came 8 days later, filed by an attorney named Gordon Fitch, who specialized in elder law, which I found interesting because the same specialty that existed to protect people like me was now being used to argue against me. Gordon Fitch's brief claimed that my actions at the Meridian were consistent with emotional instability following spousal bereavement, that my decision-making capacity had been compromised by grief, and that the documents I had served were the product of undue influence by third parties, meaning Catherine Webb and Clyde Patterson. I had anticipated this. Catherine had anticipated it more specifically than I had. She filed our response within 48 hours. It included my complete financial records going back 5 years, demonstrating consistent, rational management of assets. It included letters from my physician, from my former supervisor at the hospital, and from Clyde Patterson, all attesting to my mental clarity and decision-making capacity. It included the timeline of the credit card usage, showing that the $67,000 in charges had occurred over 26 months entirely without my knowledge or consent, and that my response had been measured, documented, and legally precise. It included one more thing: a sworn statement from 3 of Marcus's colleagues who had been present at the Meridian that evening. All 3 had independently reached out to Catherine after seeing coverage of the event on local social media. All 3 stated the same thing: that Marcus's speech had been the first provocation, that he had publicly dismissed his father in front of the assembled group, and that my response had been calm, orderly, and factual. The judge who heard the challenge was a man named Walter Keene, who had been on the family court bench for 18 years. He read both filings over 2 weeks, and then he issued a brief written ruling. The plaintiff has provided no evidence of cognitive impairment. The defendant's actions were legally sound and procedurally correct. The challenge is dismissed. All parties are to comply with the original 30-day vacate order. I was sitting in Catherine's office when she read me the ruling. The window behind her desk looked out onto a parking lot, and, past it, a row of old oak trees. Their leaves were coming in, young and pale, the particular green of early spring. I said, "Good." She said, "They have 19 days left." I said, "I know." The 19 days were not quiet, but they weren't as loud as I expected. There were 2 more voicemails from Marcus, 1 more from Brenda. The local social media situation had taken on a life of its own. Someone at the Meridian had recorded part of the confrontation, not my approach, not my voice, but Marcus's speech and the visible reaction of the room afterward. That clip had been shared widely enough that people I hadn't spoken to in years sent me messages. Former Army colleagues, people from the hospital, the neighbor from 2 houses down who I had barely spoken to since Patrice died. Most of them said variations of the same thing, that they were sorry I'd gone through this, that they had noticed something wrong, but hadn't felt it was their place to say so, that they were glad I'd handled it the way I had. Dolores left on a Tuesday, 10 days before the deadline. I was in the garage when her car pulled out of the driveway, loaded with luggage. She didn't knock on the garage door. I didn't go outside. I heard the car engine, and I heard it fade down Weston Creek Road, and I went back to the cedar chest I was finishing. On the 16th day, Marcus called at 7 in the morning. I answered, which surprised both of us, I think. He didn't say anything for a moment. I let the silence sit. He said, "I need to talk to you." I said, "Go ahead." He said, "Not like this." "Can we meet?" I said, "My house, 2 o'clock." He arrived at 1:58, which I noticed. He had always been early as a kid, because Patrice had drilled punctuality into him, and it had taken root. He was in jeans and a flannel shirt, and he looked tired, genuinely tired, the kind of tired that comes from sleeping badly for 2 weeks. We sat in the kitchen. I had made coffee. I didn't offer him any immediately, which was deliberate, and then I got up and poured him a cup anyway, because I am still his father. He wrapped his hands around the mug and looked at the table. He said, "I didn't know about the credit card. Not all of it." I waited. He said, "I knew Brenda was using it. I thought you'd approved it. She told me you had talked to her directly, that you'd said she could use it to help manage the household since you were having a hard time after Mom." I said, "I never talked to Brenda about that card." He looked up. I said, "I gave you the card for specific purposes. I never had a direct conversation with your wife about expanding access. He was quiet for a long time. He said, she told me it was settled between the two of you. I said, it wasn't. I watched him process this. The expression on his face was one I recognized from when he was 9 years old and had discovered that something he believed to be true was not. A specific kind of rearrangement behind the eyes. He said, the house, the conversations about the deed. I said, what about them? He said, I didn't bring those up. That was Brenda and her mother. I told her it was out of line. We fought about it. I looked at him. I had spent 22 years reading people in high-stakes situations, trying to determine who was telling the truth and what version of the truth they were offering. What I saw in Marcus's face was not the calculation I had seen in Brenda's. It was something simpler, something more like a man who had been standing in a room where things were happening and had told himself he wasn't responsible for the room. That's not innocent, I said. He nodded. He didn't argue with that. I said, you stood up in front of 60 people and told them you built your life without me, that you didn't owe me anything, that this chapter was yours. He said, I was wrong. I said nothing. He said, I've been wrong about a lot of things, Dad, about Brenda's honesty with me, about what I let happen in your house, about that speech. I got up and walked to the window and looked out at Patrice's rose bushes. They were showing the first buds of the year, small and tight and the color of dried blood. I said, your mother would have been very unhappy with you. He didn't respond to that for a long moment. Then he said, I know. I turned around. I said, the eviction notice stands. You and Brenda need to be out in 4 days. He said he understood. I said, when you've settled, when some time has passed, and you've had an honest accounting of the last year, you can call me. Not to negotiate, not to ask for anything, just to talk. He looked at me with the same expression I had seen at the Meridian right before the room went quiet. Something between loss and recognition. He said, is there a chance down the road that you would consider? I said, I don't make promises about down the road, Marcus. That's not how I've ever operated. He nodded. He finished his coffee. He stood up, and for a moment neither of us moved. And I thought he was going to reach out, and I wasn't sure what I was going to do if he did. But he didn't. He put the mug in the sink, because Patrice had taught him that too. And he said thank you for the coffee and walked out the front door. I stood in the kitchen for a while. The morning they moved out, I drove to the hardware store and spent an hour picking out weather stripping for the garage door, which I had been meaning to replace for a year. I came home and parked across the street and watched the moving truck in my driveway, the same way I had done everything for the past 3 months. Steady, at a distance, patient. Brenda came out of the house once and saw my truck. She stopped. She looked at me through the windshield for a moment with an expression I couldn't fully read, something between defiance and the thing that comes after defiance. Then she turned and went back inside. Marcus never looked across the street. At 2 p.m, the truck pulled out. Marcus's car followed. Brenda's car was last, and when it turned the corner onto Weston Creek Road and disappeared, I sat in my truck for a moment, looking at my driveway, empty for the first time since October. I drove in. I went inside. I walked through every room the way I had walked through. Cleared buildings in the army, methodically, from corner to corner, taking inventory. There were scuffs on the bedroom door, a scratch across the kitchen table. The third closet had been emptied and not cleaned. Small things, nothing that couldn't be remedied. I went out to the back porch and sat in the chair I had sat in the night after Patrice's funeral, when the house had felt too full of people, and I needed 10 minutes alone. The pines were the same. The evening air was the same. The rose bushes along the south fence were coming in strong. I had a conversation with Clyde Patterson that week. He was pleased with how things had resolved. He asked me if I was considering any further legal action on the credit card matter. I told him I was waiting to see how the Financial Crimes Unit review developed, that I wasn't interested in pursuing it beyond what was necessary, but that I wasn't going to foreclose on it either. Clyde said that sounded like me. David Roth reached out to say the formal review had been accepted and assigned to a case officer. He said it was likely to result in a restitution demand before any criminal question was considered. I said I understood, and to keep me informed, I went back to my cedar chest that weekend. I had been building it for no particular reason, which I now decided was not true. I had been building it for the reason I always built things, because working with your hands is a way of putting the world back in order, piece by piece, joint by joint, until what you have is something solid and true. In the evenings, I sat on the back porch and I thought about Marcus, not with anger, not even with the particular sadness that I might have expected, but with the honest clarity that comes when you've been through something real and come out on the other side of it intact. He had made choices. He would have to live with them. Whether he became the person I had hoped he would be, the person his mother had believed he was becoming, that was his work now, not mine. I am 63 years old. I live on Weston Creek Road. The house is mine, paid for, documented, clean. The rose bushes along the south fence will bloom in another 2 weeks. On Thursday mornings, I water them. I built this life through 22 years in the United States Army, another decade of work, 38 years of marriage to a woman who deserved every good thing she ever had, and more. I am not a complicated man, but I have learned that being a good man and being a patient man are not always enough to protect you from the people who mistake those qualities for weakness. What protects you is knowing the difference between love and leverage, knowing when something that looks like family has become something else entirely, and knowing that the moment you identify the difference, the only correct response is to act with precision, with documentation, and with the kind of calm that comes from having nothing to hide and nowhere to hide from. I didn't destroy my son at the Meridian. He did something far more complicated than I can fully account for, and the damage from that belongs to both of us in ways I'm still sorting through. But I stood in a room where someone I loved had decided I was finished, and I refused to be finished. I showed him, and 60 witnesses, what 30 days of patience and 30 years of work actually looked like. Sometimes justice doesn't look like anything dramatic. Sometimes it just looks like a man standing up from table 9, walking across a room, and setting down a piece of paper, and being steady enough to walk back out. If this story meant something to you, I'd ask you to subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. To hear the next story, click the box on the left.